Okay, welcome everyone. You are attending a question and answer session on managing fruit and vegetable farms during COVID-19. What actions should farms take? My name is Mark Wiltberger. I'm a business management specialist for Cornell Cooperative Extension in the Lake Ontario Fruit Program. Today, we have a great group of panelists to answer questions about this. And I'll just introduce all of them. Laura Biasillo from CCE Broome County, Elisabeth Bihn from Food Safety Institute at Cornell, Elisabeth Hodgdon from the Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program, Nathaniel Lartey from Orange County CCE, Kevin Martin from the CCE Lake Erie Regional Grape Program, Dr. Anu Rangarajan from Cornell Small Farms Program. Anu had a little bit of an emergency. She's going to try to join us if she can. Richard Stupp from the Cornell Agricultural Workforce Development Program. Myron Thurston from CCE Madison County. Myself from the Lake Ontario Fruit Program, Cornell Cooperative Extension. And Craig Kalki, also from the Cornell Cooperative Extension Lake Ontario Fruit Program. So the objective today is to gain information for strategies and practices to reduce the risk of COVID-19 occurrence and spread on your farm, and to help to contain the spread of COVID-19. And today's agenda, after the introduction, I'm going to talk very briefly about the background of COVID-19 in New York. Elisabeth Hodgdon is going to speak about key takeaways for production operations, and Laura Biasillo is going to talk about key takeaways for the retail operations. You know, we've sort of started this effort in different types of webinars and so on for the last couple of weeks. So now we're kind of getting feedback from farmers on what the key kind of things that they're taking away about what they need to do. And today we're addressing fruit and vegetable farms, and this would include anything from apples and grapes to small fruit like raspberries. And we're addressing the production side, sort of how do you manage your workers out in the field and in the office. And then also for the retail side, for a CSA, for a farm market, for a farm stand, or for a U-pick operation. So we hope to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then we will go into the question and answer session. And we scheduled this to go from 7 o'clock until 8:15, because in the other sessions we found with a little bit of a talk at the beginning to answer kind of the bulk of the meaty questions that we wanted to answer, it usually ended up going till 8:15, but we'll end it at 8:15. And then I'll make some concluding remarks. Just off the bat, I want to point out sort of the major resources we'll be looking at in this that we'll be referring to, that are resources for you to look at, that kind of form the backbone for the whole effort of increasing the safety and making a safety plan for your farm and implementing safe practices for COVID-19. And the first is the New York Forward Plan. This lists out the entire plan for the whole state and what each business needs to do and templates with which to do it. And that's kind of what drives what you need to do to create the plan that you're required to create as a business in the state. New York Ag and Markets, this site has the guidance for farmers, basically. And so in order to create a plan for an agricultural business, this is the site that has the guidance for the different types of businesses you might have in agriculture. And then there's some Cornell resources, the Cornell Agricultural Workforce Development website, which program Rich Stupp runs. In addition to having lots of information about your ag workforce in general, has a whole session devoted to the coronavirus and what businesses need to do, and guides for your business on how to do those things. And we'll talk about that. And then the Institute for Food Safety at Cornell, Elisabeth Bihn on the panel. She is a member of that institute, and there's a wealth of resources there for how to handle food safely and handle the workplace safely in the coronavirus pandemic. So a little bit of background, and I'm going to keep this short. I know we're all sick and tired of this coronavirus. It affects absolutely everybody in the world, literally. And it's all easy for us to start to think, well, it looks like we're, wipe your forehead, phew, that was a close one. But unfortunately, this type of virus is not just going to go away. We don't have a vaccine for it. We don't have any treatments for it yet. And it's very contagious and it's very nasty. This chart up here is from a few days ago, and it just shows that every single county in New York State has positive tests of coronavirus. And even now, if you look at their live dashboard, there are some remote counties that, or some unpopulated counties or low population counties that might not have a new case every day, but they do have cases every few days. And this is something we're going to have to deal with for a long time. And it's something where your business needs to take a look at it, because the better you can figure out how to handle it, the more you're going to want to continue those practices and make improvements to it. Let's say, for example, that it does decrease in the summertime, but it comes back in the fall and you're harvesting apples or handling a lot of visitors. If you don't have stuff in place then, or if you get lax on it, it's going to bite just as hard or harder the second time around. So unfortunately, that's just the nature of this very unfortunate situation we're all in. On the other side of things, in New York State, this is from a couple of weeks ago, but the trend has just continued to go down. This is the number of positive tests in New York State. And of course, we all know we went through the worst of it in March and April. But then by doing all of these extreme measures of social distancing and staying at home and avoiding contact with people, and then eventually wearing masks and so on, we were able, through those methods, which is really one of the only methods we have, to reduce the spread of this. And by doing so, we avoided our hospitals getting overwhelmed and then having a real bigger catastrophe than it kind of already was. However, every day they go out and test, if they go out and test 7,000 or 70,000 people, 700 of them will come back as positive. So that just, and those are new positive cases. So that just shows that it's out there, it's everywhere. Might not be a lot in your county, but there are probably some. And it doesn't take much for that to kind of really take off like a fire if people aren't practicing social distancing. So the point of this is to keep this infection rate low. And the way that New York is doing this is with the New York Forward Plan. And the idea of the New York Forward Plan, and there's a guide that explains the whole thing on the New York Forward site. The idea now is, how do we go back to business, but do it differently, do it with social distancing? And because if we don't do it, we're just going to have a repeat of what already happened. So we have to figure out, how do we go back to business, but how do we do it by implementing social distancing? So that's kind of the point of this whole Q&A and all of these efforts from the last few weeks, is how for your business do you specifically do it? From a kind of a large public health perspective, what's happening right now is kind of the hope is that the infection rate is low enough that by preventing the first item on the list there, by preventing the spread of it by social distancing and by using PPE and using masks, we can slow the spread of it. But when there is spread of it and somebody new catches it, to identify that person as quickly as possible, and then isolate that person as quickly possible, and then contact trace. Find out all those people that other person was in close contact with in the previous 48 hours and get to them as quickly as possible and isolate them. So the difference for your business now is, at the beginning, we were all talking about prevention. Okay, social distancing, stay at home, wear a mask, wear a face covering. But now for the businesses to open, we have to do the other three that help the general public health situation and also help your individual business by trying to identify people as quickly as possible by screening at your business, and then knowing what to do if somebody has symptoms or tests positive on getting them isolated, and then helping the local authorities contact trace. The faster this happens, the better the chance there is of containing that particular spread of the virus. So unfortunately, what that means for your business is now you have to do not just preventative techniques, but these other things, screening and have ability to contact trace by keeping records and by knowing what to do right away and isolating the person. So New York Forward Safety Plan Template, if you go online to the forward.New York site, you've probably already been there, there is a fillable template there. And this is the first page of that. And you know, it's pretty straightforward. They try to make it as easy as possible. So you're filling in your company information. Then you're starting to check certain check marks to say you're going to do certain things. And the very first one is ensure 6-foot distancing between personnel. And also there are blanks to fill out. And these address all of the aspects of the plan. So there's an example there. And you can just type it right into that sheet and save it, and then you will have completed your business safety plan. So filling in those blanks, if you fill in all those blanks and check all those check marks and make sure you're doing all the checks, you will have a plan, an effective safety plan for your farm. So that can be your guide, your roadmap, in order to know all the check marks you have to do, and also things maybe you don't have to do that aren't on there, like maybe you got some information that you need to take some other kind of test of your employees, and that's not the case. So in order to know what to put in the blanks, Cornell and Ag Workforce Development have created this New York Forward Business Safety Plan support for farms. And so that's right up at the top of the page in the menu of the Ag Workforce site. And you can type in Cornell Ag Workforce in Google. I'm sure it'll take you right to that page. And what this does is it kind of gives you suggestions for what to fill into the blanks. And it also refers you to other guidance in order to understand better sort of what kind of plan you should make. So it refers to New York State guidance. It refers to Cornell best management practices. It refers to you to CDC guidance, right in the guide that Cornell has written up. So there's an example of it. So we've taken right out of the actual safety plan template from New York State, and we've added some little red annotations that link to CDC guidance or link to New York State executive order. And then in the blue boxes that you have to fill out, we say, consider policies such as the following. And that could, if that would work for your farm, you could use that language. You could say at the end of the workday, employees shall hand wash their cloth face covering. And that answers, how are you going to keep your face coverings clean? So some of the guidance, the agricultural guidance, beginning of the month, New York State came out with some agricultural guidance. And the way to find this guidance, specifically for farms, is to go to agriculture.ny.gov, coronavirus, look for the link to coronavirus. I think it's a little bit small. I was looking for it tonight. Their link is much too tiny, but You can find it. You could Google it also. And you got to scroll down all the way to the bottom of the page. And then there's these blue boxes that are kind of like buttons, and you can click on them. And kind of the three main ones here, the main one is on the right there, guidance for prevention of and response to COVID-19 at farms. That's the main guidance they gave to farms. There's also a prevention tips for farm workers, just to the left there. And there's an operator checklist for farms, which is kind of like, it's the guidance, but it's in the form of a checklist. So you go through the checklist, you should be able to say, okay, I got to do this, I got to do this, I got to do this. So I'm just listing them here. I'm listing the links here. I know it's very difficult to look at the links here, so that's why I'm suggesting go to the coronavirus page on New York Ag and Markets. And then I'm going to pick out today another piece of guidance, because I think we have a lot of people interested in UPIC. And I think for some of you, if you've got strawberries, you're already well into it, and hopefully you're doing all right. But Cornell came out with this guidance a while ago and had some webinars about it. Cornell Best Management Practices for UPIC Farms during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is a very nice guide. It's full of details and examples, and kind of addresses every aspect of running your UPIC business. And for tonight, we're kind of assuming you've read through that instead of trying to cover all the basics of it. I'm going to very quickly go through sort of like all the stuff that the New York Forward Business Safety Plan touches on, so that when we have questions tonight, you'll sort of see where that fits in. And this business safety plan, all of these points, every single business in the state has to do this. This is not just for agriculture. They're not singling agriculture out. You know, if you've gone to the barber shop or you've gone to the restaurant, that they're doing all of these things. And I'm going to group them, how they're kind of grouped in the safety plan, and just go through them quickly. So the first category they want you to address is physical distancing. And really, for the spread of the virus, this is the most important thing, is to have physical distancing. That's the most effective way, or the most important thing for preventing the spread of this virus. So that's should always be forefront in your mind. Am I doing physical distancing? The second category is protective equipment, which for us is face coverings, but also some other things. Hygiene and cleaning. These are all almost listed in the order of importance. These are all important, but hygiene and cleaning is the third. Communication, extremely important to lower the risk for your business. Screening, we already spoke about why that's important. Contact tracing and disinfection of contaminated areas in case of in the event of a positive case. We talked about that briefly. And then there's a big space, if there are additional details for addressing specific industry guidance that don't fit clearly in other box, and you may find you have addressed it in the other boxes, or you may find you use that space to address something. Perhaps you have a break room and you want to address that in that space. So very quickly, physical distancing, their first check mark for them is, how are you going to do 6-foot distancing on your business? What are the situations where you might be hard to do 6-foot distancing? If it's not 6-foot distancing is not possible in a particular situation, everybody's going to have a face covering on. Limiting in-person gatherings as much as possible, and taking measures to reduce risk for essential in-person gatherings, things such as social distancing, having gatherings outdoors, having gatherings in well-ventilated spaces, and avoid poorly ventilated enclosed spaces. Gatherings, they put in parentheses meetings, but it could also include people working in a barn or working outside. Protective equipment. The first one is face coverings. That's very, very important. How are you going to do face coverings? How are you going to get enough face coverings? And that the business has to supply face coverings to your employees. Limit the sharing of objects and touching shared surfaces. This has to do with transmitting the virus by touching surface. And hand hygiene, very, very important. How are you going to have hand hygiene convenient for everybody at the times when they're going to need to conduct hand hygiene? Hygiene and cleaning, using the CDC and Department of Health guidance for how you do your hygiene and sanitation. Maintaining cleaning logs, this is a requirement for the plan. Hand hygiene stations. Where are you going to have hand hygiene stations? What kind of hand hygiene stations are they going to be? And what's going to be your protocol, your routine for frequent cleaning and disinfection of shared objects, surfaces, and high transit areas? The minimum for these is every day if they're used that day, and perhaps more frequently if they're used frequently. Number 4, communication. This is extremely important. Posting signage. Posting signage everywhere that it makes sense to post signage. There's tons of signage around from CDC and other websites. And also you might have some custom signage that explains to people what to do when they arrive at your place. Communication plans for employees, visitors, and customers. You don't want to forget any of those 3. You want to have a way to tell your visitors what to expect if they come and visit you, or if they can come and visit you. You want to have frequent communication and update with your employees, and you want to be able to communicate with your customers as effectively as possible. Log of visitors and workers at the work site. This is a requirement for you to have a log of visitors and workers. The exceptions are people who do contactless delivery and they drop something off. And customer log is not mandated, but they say right in it, you may encourage your customers to use it. Now, I haven't gone to the barber in a while, but other people I know have, and local barber in my small town, right after they opened, when you walk in, he says, "Hey, did you remember to sign the visitor log?" And you know, I think it's expected now. People are expected to require it. You need to think about your own business. If you're kind of like a grocery store, it might not make sense. But if you work with individuals, you know, one group at a time, it may make sense to do that. Part of communication is notifying state and local health departments right away for a positive COVID-19 test. And right in the requirements there, it says cooperating with contact tracing efforts by the Department of Health. Screening. Screening is mandatory. Mandatory health screening assessment for employees and essential visitors. And contact tracing and disinfection of contaminated areas in the event of a positive case. The contact tracing, this is something you'll do with the local health department. As soon as you contact them, they'll tell you about that. And the disinfection, the reason you need to plan for that is you need to have the correct materials on hand, and you have to know what the protocol is for when you can go in and disinfect and how to do that. My screen is blocked here. Have a plan for cleaning and disinfection, have a plan for contact tracing. And then the final one is just additional details addressing specific industry guidance, and that's using guidance and best practices for your industry. How are you specifically going to tackle something that's kind of particular to your industry? And as I said before, there's a safety plan support document right at the Ag Workforce website. And now we're going to have Elisabeth talk about key takeaways for production operations. And Elisabeth, just let me know when you want to forward the next slide.
All right, thanks, Mark. So I'm going to be talking about key takeaways for the production aspect of your farm. So what happens in the field with your workers, in your wash pack areas, just general operations on the farm. And what I'm going to be saying echoes that list that Mark just talked about. So communication I'm putting first, just because employee training is really important in making sure that your COVID safety plan is carried out in the way, you know, as planned. And so I'm putting that first here on my list. And so it's really important to make sure that your employees understand how COVID-19 is transmitted and what symptoms they should be looking out for. And that list of symptoms by the CDC is changing quite frequently, actually. There's quite a few other symptoms that were added later on this spring, other than just simply a cough and fever. They should be fully aware of your policies and why they're in place. And there are luckily quite a few different materials available to help growers with employee training. And so there are materials and printable signs available in multiple languages through the CDC and other sources. So it's really important that the employee training is done in a language that the employees are comfortable with. I also encourage people to think about writing and implementing standard operating procedures for anything that needs to be done consistently. So for example, your cleaning protocols, so that every employee that does that procedure is doing it consistently. And also employing different signage to make sure that tasks are done consistently and just to serve as visual reminders for employees. And, many employees who are coming back to work this season, it may be their, 10th season on the farm, and maybe, this year is going to be quite different in many different aspects. And so it's important to incorporate some regular refresher trainings or reminders just to make sure that employees are following your plan and remembering what is expected of them, because it's different this year. And we also encourage people to use visual reminders. And so those spots on the floor at 6-foot intervals to help employees remember to maintain 6-foot physical distancing can be really useful. And I also encourage, if you're listening to this webinar as an owner operator, or if you're a manager or a crew leader, to make sure that you are following the safety plan as well, because you should serve as a role model for your workers and your customers. So if you're not wearing a mask, your employees are less likely to wear one as well. So you want to make sure that you're being a good role model for following your own plan. And so second on my list, so Mark mentioned physical distancing is actually probably the most important, the most important thing to think about when we think about how COVID-19 is spread. So it's spread by respiratory droplets. And so it's really important this season to think about the operations on your farm and which areas on your farm are most at risk. And so outdoor areas, the risk is much lower, but indoor areas where people are in close proximity and in areas with poor ventilation are the most risky. So you should think about those areas. So for example, machine shops, wash pack sheds, offices, vehicles. Think about adjusting your activities and your work schedules so that you can separate people and ensure that greater than 6-foot distance if at all possible. So whether that means taking multiple vehicles to the field rather than putting everybody in one van, or making multiple trips, or staggering shifts in greenhouses or high tunnels so that there aren't many workers working side by side in an indoor place, that can go a long way in preventing transmission if there were to be a sick employee on the farm. And let's see. Yeah, I think, Mark, we can move to the next slide. So face covering usage. If workers do need to work in close proximity at that less than 6-foot distance, it's really important that they're wearing a face covering. And wearing a face covering can reduce the spread of respiratory droplets in the air. And so it's important that employees have access to those face coverings and have them on them. So I think we received a question about, if workers are in the field, do they need to wear a face covering? If they're working spread apart in the field, they don't necessarily have to wear a face covering, but it is a good idea to have it on them. So maybe they carry it around in their pocket or around their neck, so that if there were to be an occasion where, say, they had to jump in a vehicle with somebody else or get into a tractor cab with somebody else, that they would be able to put one on when they do need to be close to somebody. And there's also, we've received quite a few questions about whether or not, say, for example, a really, really small farm where it's just, 2 people, partners who are sharing the same household and managing the farm together, would they necessarily have to wear face masks when in close proximity working on the farm? So that is, the answer there is no. So, because those people are living in the same household, they're sort of in that same cohort. But certainly if, multiple employees are working together on the farm in close proximity, a mask is a good idea. I've added this point, so face covering should be used by field workers if they come into retail areas. I've seen this on a few different farms where, somebody's working outside by themselves in the field, but then they come into the retail area amongst customers. It's important, again, if you have that face covering in your pocket, put it on so that you can set a good example around customers in the store. And again, this will come up quite a bit during our webinar today, but recording your decision-making process and your actions is important, so that you have a record of these protocols that you're employing this year for COVID safety. Hygiene, cleaning, and sanitizing. So this is to prevent COVID transmission from touch. And I'm putting hand washing stations here as the first bullet, and improving access to hand washing stations with running water and soap on the farm can really go a long way for preventing COVID transmission, as well as just for food safety in general. And it needn't be a really expensive hand washing station that you purchase or rent from somebody locally. It could just be something that you make yourself. And there are several do-it-yourself designs available online so that you can build one yourself. And you can put these, I've seen hand washing stations this year at Pick Your Own, so that customers will wash their hands before they start picking. At farmers markets, you might consider putting a couple extra around your farm in the fields for workers as well, so that they can wash their hands after they've eaten their snack during break or whatnot. And if hand washing isn't available, I encourage you to, if you're in New York State, take advantage of free hand sanitizer that's available at your local CCE office. And then in terms of cleaning and sanitizing and disinfection, so prioritize cleaning those commonly touched surfaces. And so think about the day-to-day operations on your farm and the flow of workers and what people touch, and really prioritize those surfaces that have multiple people touching them. And so that could be shared tools. If you can't assign tools to individual workers, perhaps you would have an SOP for cleaning tools in between uses. Lunch tables, kitchen counters, areas in break rooms that people might touch, restrooms, those areas would need frequent cleaning. And the frequency of that really depends on usage. So we've also received a lot of questions about how often do I need to clean my restroom? And that really depends on the number of employees you have, and how often they're in that particular area of the farm and using it. So just think about what makes sense for your farm, and every farm is different. So really we encourage people to just think about your day-to-day operations and try to pinpoint those areas of highest risk on your farm and focus on those. So again, vehicles, commonly touched surfaces in vehicles. So no, you don't have to sanitize, the whole inside of, the truck cab, but maybe just the steering wheel, whatever the driver and people would touch in those vehicles. And continue to practice whatever food safety procedures that you have been doing. So sanitizing food contact surfaces, using wash water sanitizers, using appropriately labeled products. So we know that the virus that causes COVID-19 isn't a foodborne virus, but we encourage people to maintain your normal food safety procedures. And again, I want to highlight here the importance of using standard operating procedures and logging your cleaning so that you have proof that it was done. And by using an SOP or that standardized operating procedure, that list of instructions on how to do something, that helps ensure that every employee that follows that cleaning protocol is doing it consistently. And then lastly, health screening. And so as part of the New York Forward COVID safety plan that Mark was talking about, the last part of this plan mentions health screening. And so as part of this, employees, including yourself, and so one question I've received about small farms is, if it's just a one-person operation, do you need to do this? And so the answer is yes. So people working on the farm must answer a questionnaire before each workday or shift, or every 12 hours, answering these 3 questions. So whether or not you've had COVID-19 symptoms in the past 14 days. So consult that list of symptoms from the CDC. Again, it can change frequently. Have you had a positive COVID-19 test in the past 2 weeks? And have you had close contact with a person with a confirmed or suspected COVID case in the past 2 weeks? And so close contact is defined as within 6 feet of another person for more than 15 minutes from 2 days prior to their illness, or for an asymptomatic person who did test positive for 2 days prior to that positive test. And then the New York State recommends, they say that you should check employee temperature. And so you can do this on farm, making sure that whoever is screening the individuals is wearing proper PPE to protect themselves. So you could do an on-site check using an infrared thermometer. You could use a self-reporting system for your employees. So the temperature that we're looking for here is 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And also, think this through and have a plan in place of what you'll do if an employee answers yes to any of the questions and does not pass the screening. So, think about if you do have an employee who happens to be sick on the farm, what will you do to clean that area and make sure that you're preventing the spread to other employees? And in terms of this health screening, what records you need to keep. So recording worker temperatures, that's considered to be a medical exam. And so there are some requirements for record keeping for that can be quite burdensome. So for this, really, my recommendation is just keeping the record really simple. A pass-fail checklist for each employee for each day can be adequate. So simply, did they answer no to these 3 questions? And so Rich, if you have something to add here, we can wait until later.
No, that's fine. We'll go ahead. You're doing great.
Okay, great. So now we'll move on to retail.
Great, thank you, Elisabeth. That was a great start for us today. So hopefully all of you are writing some questions in the Q&A. I haven't seen any yet, but I know it's a lot of information. But please, take a few minutes and write anything in the Q&A that you might have questions about. So now we're going to talk about some key takeaways for retail operations. So Mark, if you want to go to the first slide, that'd be great. So we are going to start here with safety of employees. And so we talked a little bit about this, but just to hammer it home again, we want to remind everybody that employees are required to wear a mask, and any customers that come to your farm stand or UPIC or CSA will be required to wear masks or face coverings. New York State has passed laws which give you the right to refuse service to anyone who is not wearing a mask. One recommendation that we do give is that if possible, if you would like, you can buy some of the single-use masks and have them available at your farm in case customers come. Maybe they just forgot it because, for whatever reason, and you can offer that to them as an alternative without having to refuse service. When possible, having your employees not travel in the same vehicle to off-farm markets. But as Elisabeth said, if you do have to travel in that same vehicle, that's why we have them carry that mask around so that way they can keep themselves and the other person safe. And then really just having one employee at a time that's entering those stock rooms or coolers or bathrooms or other confined places in your farm market or your farm stand or really any place on the farm. Next slide. When we're thinking about safety of employees, we're also thinking about that, packing lines. And so, Elisabeth talked about this a little bit, but, when possible, we want to try to set up those packing lines for packing bagged and pre-ordered produce, whether that's CSA or your farm market or your farm stand, and trying to keep those employees 6 feet apart. And also really trying to set up those in an area with good ventilation or outside. You want to make sure that if you are thinking about outside, that you're also thinking about food safety as well. So you always want to consider that in the context of any of these recommendations. When possible, we want to think about assigning high-risk employees to tasks that minimize their contact with customers. And when we're talking about high risk, we're really talking about any employee who is over the age of 60 or who has a compromised immune system, or perhaps takes care of or lives with someone with a compromised immune system. Next slide. Next is customer communication. And so this is really important, especially for any retail operation. So really what we want you to think about is that you want to be training your employees to encourage customers to practice social distancing and to ensure that masks or face coverings are worn at the market. Elisabeth had mentioned that we really want all of you to be modeling that good behavior so that your employees are also doing it. And it's very difficult to have an employee asking a customer to wear a face covering if they themselves are not. The next is thinking about how do we communicate this information. So Elisabeth talked about some great signage, Mark talked about some great signage that is available. You know, using that on your website and on your social media, talking to your customers about what your social distancing policies are. You know, is it that you are asking only one person from a family to come and pick up their CSA share? Is it that when you're doing U-Pick that you have certain areas or certain rows that you're only allowing people to be in to encourage social distancing? You want to use those mechanisms to be communicating that information. You want to be posting signs at checkout to emphasize that physical distancing. So think about the X's on the floor that we see everywhere, or traffic cones I've now seen people using, or even flags, which is part of the recommendations in the U-Pick best management practices. And then finally, as I just mentioned, you know, posting signs encouraging maybe only one family member to check out while others go back to their vehicle. This is something that's, you know, easy to do and will help with any potential congestion in your checkout area. Next slide. As we continue to think about customer communication, we're thinking about signage that's going to instruct customers not to handle product for sale. So when possible, pre-bagging as much as you can so that customers can simply point to something and it can be handed to them, instead of, as we sometimes feel happens at perhaps a farmer's market, or you see at your farm stand where that customer has to touch and feel every single tomato or pepper that they might see available. It limits the number of people that are touching any surface that would then need to be sanitized later. You want to think about that directional flow through your stand or through your farm market and lay it out visually. So using arrows or signs with arrows also work very well. Encouraging pre-orders to minimize time that customers are in contact with employees or each other. This can also work for on-farm CSA pickups, so encouraging perhaps the first third of the alphabet to come at one time, and then, you know, the next half hour, the next third of the alphabet, so that you're minimizing the potential number of people that are going to be coming in contact with anybody. And then finally, hand sanitizer or hand washing stations being made available for customers at entry and exit. I've even seen U-Pick farms putting them out in the fields for customers to be using when they're done picking strawberries or other items like that. And then signage that's reminding them about the importance of hand washing, proper hand washing techniques. And this signage is available through the Produce Safety Alliance. And so if you have any specific questions about that, please put them in the Q&A, and Betsy Bihn, I'm sure will be able to help answer them. And finally, with hand sanitizer, I just want to mention as well, but we can stay on that slide, is that your local Cornell Cooperative Extension should still have hand sanitizer and masks available for you and your employees. And so if you have not yet received any, if you are running low, please please contact your local Cornell Cooperative Extension office and ask them for the sanitizer, because we all have them and that's the reason that we have them. So please reach out to us, any of us on the call, or you can visit cce.cornell.edu and find your local extension office. Next slide. So when we're thinking about how to actually maintain social distancing, we've talked about a lot of these already, but you want to try to create a clear entry and exit point for market flow if it's possible. When I think about this, I think about Starbucks. Now you have to go in one door and then you exit out of a different door so that you have traffic coming in one way and exiting a different way. Having one-way aisles, so think about, you know, how we all, maybe if we go to the grocery store, how that's set up, that we go up one aisle and come back another, while trying to maintain that 6-foot separation. And then, as I said earlier, trying, you know, if possible, to keep a supply of disposable masks available for customers who don't have a mask or a face covering, but obviously encouraging through our social media or our websites or other signage that we are requiring masks. Next slide. We have a few specific recommendations we just wanted to bring up right now. The first is one recommendation for pick your own farms is to number rows and then assign customers to specific rows. And the reason that we try to do this is because depending on the type of product, thinking about things like strawberries or blueberries, and perhaps even apples, that it's very difficult to get people to social distance when the plants are so close together. And so by assigning people rows, you're able to intentionally social distance people. And, you know, another thing that we also suggest is that, you know, you can let customers know that if a field is full, they could stay in their car, if possible, placing an employee in the field so that they can not only help with that social distancing, but perhaps resupply customers with containers, allowing the customer to stay where they are picking. I have seen many U-Pick farms, instead of encouraging people to bring their own containers to pick in, providing them with those single-use berry boxes to be able to be picking to help speed that piece along as well. For CSAs with on-farm pickup, we mentioned it might be helpful to set specific times for customers to pick up their produce, and that also it would be pre-bagged. Many CSAs go with a market-style CSA, but unfortunately that encourages every single person to be touching all of the produce. And so it may make more sense to not only spread the pickup times out, but also pre-bag everything. And then the other just piece I want to add to this is that there are some really great websites that can help if you need to be thinking about scheduling your customers. So things like Sign Up Genius are a really great option. Next slide. And that's all I got.
Okay, we're going to open it to questions now. We have some pre-submitted questions, and also you can enter questions in the Q&A box on your screen, and we'll address those as well. So Craig, if you want to start off, and we'll just be asking the panel different questions.
Sure, this is one that came in prior to the meeting. I think it's for Rich. Are there updated recommendations for H-2A workers in housing or about an employee screening protocol?
So there really aren't any updated recommendations prior to a few weeks ago or a month or so ago. So with H-2A housing, the rules were made more flexible so that growers could get some additional housing, because the whole point is to find additional housing if needed and spread that housing out for folks so that we could do more social distancing within the housing. When Ag and Markets and Department of Health put out the interim guidance for agriculture for New York State, there is some short recommendations in there about housing as well, which you can visit that. I think Mark talked about that early on, but not anything real extensive there. The screening part of it, I think, is getting at screening when people arrive from out of the country typically. And so just a couple of thoughts there. Yes, you think of that as an entry point to the workforce. So you definitely want to be screening to make sure that people are not currently sick with COVID so that they don't come into your workforce and get everyone else sick. If someone is arriving from out of the country, there is still the requirement for quarantine for those folks for the 14 days. Now, that being said, farm workers, including H2A workers, can work while they're in quarantine. So how that works is that you want to be able to quarantine the folks, the new arrivals in housing, and keep them separate from people who are already here as much as possible. You want to also then quarantine them at work. So if there's places that you can keep the new arrivals working in one part of the business while people who have already been here are in another part of the business, then you can quarantine them that way. So they're quarantining for that 14 days, but also working during that period of time.
Thank you, Rich. Got one that came in a little while ago. Has there been any talk of how large a cohort can be? For example, 50 workers travel from Mexico to New York in a bus for 2 days. This would then be considered a cohort, correct?
I'll take a swat at this. Yeah, if you keep them as a cohort, they're a cohort, I guess, if you want to call it that. I think what you have to think about is operationally on the farm, what are you going to do with a 50-person cohort? If your entire work crew is 50 people, you don't want to have that all season long, because if they get sick, they could all likely get sick. So I appreciate that when people are traveling up here, they may be a cohort, but my recommendation would be to, once people are here, have them break out and start quarantining into smaller cohorts, because sure, you can have a 50-person cohort, but there's your liability. And I think that's too much, unless you're on an enormous farm and you've got hundreds, if not thousands of workers, right? But for most of our farms here in New York, I would say that is way too big. And I would really think about trying to get them a couple of weeks separated and build them into different cohorts. And that's not what they asked, but that's just what I'm recommending.
Thank you, Betsy. Another one came in on the Q&A box. Any recommendations for handling folks who wear masks incorrectly or cannot medically tolerate one? Is it okay to make them leave or wait in their car?
So I'll jump in on that one. Certainly you can demonstrate how a mask should be worn. Of course, never touch their mask. The big thing, they talk about masks need to be worn by everyone, but I would think if you saw someone who was elderly and perhaps having trouble breathing, that you wouldn't kick them back out because they weren't wearing a mask. I mean, you can use common sense in that particular situation. Same thing with little kids, right? I have a 5-year-old. I know how hard it is to get her to do anything for a long period of time. So, I mean, as long as people are making the attempt, my opinion is that, you shouldn't kick them out of the business unless they make you uncomfortable. But it is very exclusive situations where that's really even a realistic expectation. 99% of the people that come into your business should be wearing a mask. You should be able to tell that they're, if they say they're not wearing a mask, that they're doing it for potentially political reasons, then you're definitely within your right to ask them to leave or not serve them.
Thank you, Myron.
Just to add to that, one little thing for your employees, it might be important from a liability perspective to distinguish between a mask and a face covering. I know sometimes the CDC doesn't do that, but OSHA certainly does. So if they've never had a health screening and there are some health concerns, especially if they can establish them, you want to make sure that they may not wear things like N95 masks that restrict breathing, but continue to wear a face covering, whether it's cloth or disposable, that typically wouldn't lead to those health concerns.
Thank you, Kim. This one came in a few days ago, and we've heard various iterations of this question, so I'm going to kick it out. It's probably going to go to Rich. If an employee stays home due to symptoms, is there financial help to pay them?
Yeah, so good question there. So one of the early programs that the federal government developed was the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And in that, there were 80 hours of sick time that was made available for employees who need to miss work because they're either sick with coronavirus, or they're waiting for the results of a test, or they are caring for someone else that is doing one of those things, is sick or quarantined. So the advantage to that particular program is that the federal government will pay for the costs of those 80 hours for the employee to be off. And the way that works is that the employer pays the sick time to the employee to begin with. So the employee takes off, let's say they need to take off 4 days or something while they're awaiting a test result. The employer pays that employee for those days that they were off for sick time. And then the employer gets reimbursed by the federal government through their quarterly payroll. So you file and you pay your taxes, income taxes, and Social Security taxes and so forth every quarter for the employees. You just withhold the amount of that sick time on that quarterly payroll filing, and so you're essentially reimbursed for that right away.
Thank you, Rich. On the Q&A, we have a wooden play area for our U-Pick customers. Now that playgrounds are open, should they be able to open them? Anyone want to stab at that?
First off, I don't believe playgrounds are opened again yet. That would be part of phase 4, which technically should be Friday, but there's some areas excluded from that. So I would say check with your local health department, because they're going to have some pretty strong opinions likely on playgrounds. So, you know, we could give you a blanket statement that says phase 4 allows playgrounds, great, go ahead and use it, but your local health department may disagree with that. So you should be able to find the information for your local health department, call them and say, hey, I've got a playground and I'd love to start using it. You know, what are your thoughts? Pretty good chance that they're going to say after this Friday that that's fine, but it always is better to check.
Thank you, Myron. We have both volunteers and employees harvesting. Should we ask them to wear gloves? Good one.
This is Betsy. I'll take that one. Gloves are not a requirement. For food safety, we want people to wash their hands and have clean hands if they're harvesting produce that people are going to eat. So you want to make sure people are washing their hands. Gloves are definitely not a requirement. And sometimes gloves are hard to find. So that's the other issue. But really, clean hands is the issue, not gloves.
Thanks, Betsy.
And in order to add to what Petty said, even before you put your hands in gloves, you also need to make sure you wash your hands with soap and clean water before you do so. So, like you said, it's not a food safety requirement, but if you have all the necessary things in place, you can have it on.
Thanks, Nathaniel. Is it safe to have drinking fountains for customers? Good one. You want to stab at that?
I know many places are not using drinking fountains. I know places that are getting ready to open, like YMCAs and stuff, are definitely not using drinking fountains. I don't know if there is any legal consequence of this. I think the problem becomes with drinking fountains, certainly, is cleaning them in between each customer and all of that. So the management becomes a bigger deal. The other thing, I know this sounds silly, but people waiting in line for the drinking fountain. So depending on where your drinking fountain is, you don't want people within 6 feet of each other. That line could get really far, really fast, and clog up other traffic depending on where it's at. So I think it's probably best to not have a drinking fountain open. And I think there's cover with COVID, but I don't know legally where that stands. I want to be clear about that.
Thanks, Betsy. Yeah, I mean, people bring water everywhere they go. And I've been in some state parks, maybe only phase one, and they just have big plastic bags over the fountains.
Mhm.
Or not sure of the legalities. I think it would be better to cover the fountains, in my opinion.
Mhm.
Another question, do other countries, Mexico, for example, screen people for COVID-19 symptoms before allowing them to enter the US?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any particular health screening that people have to go through before coming into the U.S. Interesting, I'll follow up on that because we're going to head into the fall, and there will be people coming from other parts of the United States, Florida, Texas, for example, as the migrant workforce inside the U.S. Comes up to the northeastern part of the country. And you may want to consider how you're going to screen those folks, because they're having a lot of outbreaks in those parts of the country. And so a producer actually just asked me the other day, can you screen people where they are before they come to your farm? And there's no particular rules or guidance saying that you can or you cannot. In fact, it might be a really good idea to have them or request at least them to have a test where they are before migrating north to your farm. That way, if they are positive, then they can deal with that back there rather than exposing people all along the way and then at your farm to the virus.
Thanks, Rich.
Also, to add to it, with regards to other countries screening people, before the COVID became intensive and the borders being closed, it was in existence because I was traveling from Ghana to the US and they have to screen me from Ghana before I go here. So with country to country, it was then in place. But like Rich was saying, I don't know if they still have it, but I know they should be able to have it since the COVID became very intense, so that when they cross the border and they come in, then US also takes over from there.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Got one here, probably for Laura. With my UPIC farm, do I need every single person coming in to sign a log? Question mark. Using the same pen? Question mark.
Yep, so that is a very good question. Obviously we don't want people using that same pen if possible, but then that's where we ask about having hand sanitizer available. And one thing that I have seen is sort of a cup that says clean pens and then a cup that says dirty pens. And so the idea is that people sanitize their hands, they take the pen from the clean pen cup, and then after they use it, they put it in the dirty pen cup, and then there's an employee that's sanitizing those pens, once sort of everything gets moved from one clean cup to the dirty cup. So that's one way that you can get around that, where you don't have everybody using the same pen.
But I will throw in there that the log is an important piece, at least getting people's names and phone numbers. And I know right at this moment, people are not used to that, but if you go into any retail shops right now, that are any small mom and pop style retail shops, almost all of them are going to have a log sign in. So people are going to get much more used to that idea that they need to sign in when they go to a business. Certainly that doesn't change that it's going to be a adjustment process for people.
And I would just add to that, that the purpose of that log is to do contact tracing. So it's actually of benefit to the person signing in, because if the business has that person's contact information, then there's some sort of possibility that people at that shop at a certain time were in contact with someone who had COVID-19, then those people could be reached, which means they could find out early if they might have been exposed, which helps them. And then it just helps the public health situation in general to try to contain it. But it is an unusual situation, and I know businesses are like, do I want to ask everybody for this? It is optional, but encouraged, or you can encourage customers to leave. I think all you need is a name and a phone number, and then people could get a hold of them.
Thanks, Mark.
Greg, can I jump in with some breaking news there?
Sure, yeah, I was going to read it, but go for it, Rich.
Okay. So a follow-up to my earlier answer a few minutes ago, thanks to David Cox and to our colleague there, Joan Petson, who pointed out that just today, the governor of New York announced that anyone traveling into not just New York, but also New Jersey and Connecticut from the following states: Alabama, Arkansas, Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, Utah, and Washington will have to do a 14-day quarantine period. So that's the breaking news here for today. So I'm sure that would apply to ag workers, and I'm sure that they would also be, as we talked about before, they would be able to, if they're farm workers, they'd be able to work while they're in that quarantine period. But it is required for people traveling from those states.
I knew he was threatening it. I didn't know he had done it. That's interesting.
Is that for like all visitors to New York?
It is.
That'll be an interesting one to enforce.
Wow.
I don't think they're going to be throwing grandma in jail. I think they're just to encourage her to quarantine.
Just to let folks know, we're getting a lot popping now that we're certainly not going to have time to cover. We'll try to save them and be able to possibly answer them by another means. But here's one. Is it legal to require a COVID-19 test before a quarantine employee returns to work if they're symptom medication free for 72 hours? Not sure if anybody here can answer that. Anybody want to take a stab? Well, you should have like a person from department.
Could you say that again, Craig?
Sure. Is it legal to require COVID-19 test before a quarantine employee returns to work if they're symptom free for 72 hours?
I was talking with somebody the other day about that, and if somebody has symptoms, it's almost like you want to cross those bridges when you get to them, although maybe the person who asked the question has gotten to that bridge. It's not clear to me what you can require or not require, because getting tested is not necessarily that easy, and it depends on the doctor and so on. I think I've gone maybe too far out on a ledge on that. I don't know if Rich or anybody else has anything to add.
I have one here. Now that outside eating is open at restaurants, can people come and picnic outside while social distancing?
I do not know legally where farms fall. I know initially entertainment was prohibited, but what I would say to you is, and Mark said this maybe before we were live, but one of the hardest things that's happening on farms is crowd management. And so when you bring people in for that, that becomes more people you have to manage on the farm. Now, if you're up for it and you want to do it, then I think you need to just legally check. But I know, and maybe I don't know if Rich wants to weigh in on this, I know initially entertainment was not allowed, but I'm not sure where we are in the phase part of that.
Yeah, sorry, I was thinking hard about that last question and trying to come up with the right answer. I missed this one. What was this one?
Are you allowed, now that you're allowed to eat out at restaurants, are they allowed to bring entertainment like picnicking back to the farm?
I'm going to speak from somebody who's familiar with the wineries. I do not believe wineries are allowed to bring in bands and that sort of thing. Like they're not restaurants. They're not being scrutinized for their capacity in that sense. The other thing is just the reports we've had from U-Pick places is it's really hard to manage. They're getting a lot of people coming to the U-Picks, and it's really hard to manage the crowds and get people to socially distance. And some people I've talked to, they're putting in a lot of physical stuff, like putting up survey stakes and ribbon 7 feet apart so people will be socially distanced when they're waiting in line. And so it's a whole lot just to manage people coming to do U-Pick and leaving to do U-Pick. It seems like, I don't know, if we're on a small scale and you thought people were just eating separately, but just managing the people coming in and out seems like it's quite a challenge right now for people.
Thanks. What about unstaffed CSA sites where members are opening wax boxes and removing their liner bags of pre-packed vegetables? Can we safely reuse those boxes a week later?
That I think is, first of all, for what we know about survival on particles don't do well on those.
Betsy, if I can interrupt you, Betsy, your audio cut out for about 5 seconds.
Okay, sorry.
You might want to kill your video, maybe. That might help.
Okay, I'll try that. The survival of the virus on things like cardboard is not good. I don't think the studies have been done on waxed cardboard, but the surfaces, they're not surviving well on surfaces. When it comes to reusable boxes, I start to worry about food safety. But if you have all the stuff prepackaged in liners where it's not touching the box, then I would not be worried at all about using them the next week. I think the risk is low, minimum.
Craig, if I could throw in a similar question to the CSA, people being alone. We got this a couple of times at least. How do you manage a COVID-19 on a self-serve farm stand or vegetable stand? We got that at least twice.
Well, again, COVID's not foodborne, right? So really, I think where you're going with a self-serve stand is when you're out there, make sure you're cleaning it, right? In between stocking it up. You might want to clean off the box where they shove the money. And you might want to offer people hand sanitizer at the stand so they can use the hand sanitizer. You may want to put up signs encouraging people, to only pick up what they're going to buy, right? Look at it with your eyes and then pick it up and only take that stuff. So encouraging people not to touch produce. That's again more related to food safety than to COVID. But I think you can do it, and you can make people feel more comfortable by providing some guidance there, using those things as a guide.
Yeah, I was working with a small farm a couple weeks ago, and they have a really small shed that's a self-serve stand, and their plan was to stick a sign on the front of the building with their policies, and so they are limiting one person in at a time. They're having hand sanitizer available for people to use when they come in. They have, money drop box where people can just stick it in, and they're pre-bagging everything.
And as Elisabeth said earlier, it's all about communication. I know there are people who are not going to follow, and I know there are people that are going to do what they want. But the vast majority of people really just want to know what they're supposed to be doing and what the expectation is. And communication is really the key. People really feel much more comfortable when they understand the expectation.
Thank you. I got 8:15, so I'm going to let Mark unmute and wrap us up.
Yes, we're going to wrap up now. This is being recorded and it will be up. We've put up the previous Q&A session. The Q&A session previously was really about managing field crews, and it addressed housing issues, and we had David Bell from the Department of Health for Orleans County talk about those kinds of issues. So we did get a few questions about housing, and so that's a good one to refer to. It's all recorded. And also in a couple of weeks on July 16th, Craig, at noon,
Yes.
we're having a third session, and this is going to be really for packing houses because there are certain issues that they face that aren't necessarily faced on farms, and a lot of overlapping issues as well. So we want to thank everybody for coming to this session. I want to thank all of the panelists, and I guess I would refer back to these kind of main resources that I mentioned earlier. And I don't know if we were able to get those in the chat, but the Ag Workforce site and the Institute for Food Safety site at Cornell really can get you on your way to answering some of these things. The other thing I would say is, you know, we're all available to answer these questions. And, you know, it was a shame we could not get to them all tonight, but really we would be here till 9 o'clock if we were. So please email us, email your county person, email regional team that you're a member of. You know, we know that this is all a brand new situation for everybody. And a lot of these questions there really aren't answers to yet, and we have to sort of figure them out or, you know, sort them out. But we're really here to help. And so I just encourage you to contact whoever at CCE you want to contact, and they will get you in touch with one of us who has kind of looked deep into these issues for this COVID crisis. Is there anything else left, Craig, that I should mention?
No, and we cleared the Q&A window, and the couple people that put them in the chat, and we're in great shape.
Okay, and did any of the panelists have any urgent things that they wanted to say before we finished? Okay, all right, thank you all for coming, and have a good evening.